productivity is always output over input. Now, in the previous scenario, we evaluated the productivity of Lenark's strawberry operations in terms of land. Strawberries was the output, land was the input. This particular scenario is a multi-factor scenario. We're back to the same strawberry operation, but now we have more than one input. Let's take a look. Let's see. One key to productivity of Lenark's tunnel operation is the higher air temperature under the plastic tents, extending the length of the growing season, but making plants more vulnerable to disease. Interesting. As a result, Lenark spends $225 per acre on, now I'm going to underline this. You know, usually I'm interested in numbers, but here it's nouns. Preventive chemical treatments in its tunnel operation, whereas it only spends $20 per acre for its open fields. The tunnel operation costs $120 per acre to construct and maintain throughout 1 year. All Lenark's strawberries require $125 per acre to plant and $600 per ton to harvest and pack. Oh, the actual question is now, how productive is Lenark's open field operation? Okay, now usually in a scenario what I'm always underlying is the numbers, and I'm sure that we are going to use those numbers. But in the case of a multi-factor productivity problem or analysis, the first thing we have to do is words. We have to recognize what all the various inputs are. Oh, okay. Now, wait. We listed 3 at least. No, wait a minute. 4 actually were mentioned in this paragraph. We still have the original input that was discussed in the previous scenario. We have to remember that that's land. Oh, now, it is asking about their open field operations, correct? That is from last time. 50 acres that produced 25 tons of strawberries. I'm just noting this. This is just, if you would, this is just a fact. Okay, now, in order to assess the productivity of the open fields operation, now that we have information on chemical treatments and planting, essentially what we need to do is we need to tally all of the costs involved. Working a multi-factor productivity analysis is a lot like preparing an invoice. Oh, meaning that there's a certain amount of scratch work, and really the key is just staying organized. You can see that in the note frames there's already a sort of a header to organize our computations. The open air fields, tons of strawberries. Well, I had just mentioned that from last time. They produced 25 tons. This is the complex part, total expenses. All of the expenses that were mentioned, well, let's see, open air fields, chemical treatments were mentioned. I'm just taking notes to myself here. Chemical treatments. Let's see, wait. Tunnel operation costs $250 per acre to construct and maintain. I'm making a list of expenses because I want to compute the expenses, but it's the open air fields. So I could put tunnel construction. But for the open air fields, actually, that's going to be exactly 0 expense, right? Because there aren't any tunnels. Nonetheless, there's planting. And there's also harvesting and packing. Now, what was I doing? I was just listing all the ways that you can spend money making strawberries. Why? Because the denominator of a multi-factor productivity measure rolls up all the expenses concerning the inputs to that operation. Now I essentially have the line items that I need for my invoice. Oh, because in order to calculate total expense for the open air fields, I say to myself, chemical treatments. $225 an acre per chemical treatments, except wait a minute, that's in its tunnel operation. Oh, open air fields is where you catch a break, and it's only $20 per acre for the open air fields. Okay, that's 50 acres times $20 per acre. We have spent now $1,000 on chemical treatment. Okay, and then what's next? Well, I don't really need to include the tunnel construction and maintenance. I could. It would be 0 times what's 250. There's no tunnel construction and maintenance for the open air fields. There is, however, planting expenses. Let's see, it doesn't matter how they're grown. They cost $125 per acre to plant. So I would want to say 125 times 50 because there's 50 acres. 6,250 is what I get for planting expenses for the open air fields. And then finally, harvesting and packing. Here's another charge right here, $600. $600 times, oh, and I need to be careful. Don't be paranoid, it's only logic, but it's the issue of cost drivers. I was calculating expenses concerning the open air fields, and so I said, for instance, the $20 for chemical treatments times the $50 for acres, and then I said the $125 for the planting times the 50 acres. Notice the harvesting and packing is per ton of output, so I say $600, that's what I wrote down in ink, right? But I don't say times 50, that's in acres. $600 times in tons, the amount of strawberries that was produced, that's 600 times 25. Or the biggest expense category yet, $15,000 for harvest and packing. Okay, now at this point, I have the 3 relevant expenses. What do I do now? Oh, wait a minute. What was it I was actually doing scratch work for here? Total expenses. I would want to add up 1,000 plus 6,250 plus 15,000. I get 22,250. Now what have I done? I have just calculated the total annual expense of their open air field operation. Okay, is that the answer? No, we're trying to calculate the productivity of the open air operation. We remember that productivity is always output over input. The multi-factor measure would be the one output, 25 tons of strawberries, divided by, or the ratio to, total input. Well, how much did we spend? That's what that column is now that we've totaled up. That's the denominator, because the actual measure is 25, as in tons of strawberries, divided by 22,250. This number right here goes into the denominator. Oh, all right, so put that in your calculator, and you're probably seeing the same thing I did, 0.00112. 0.00112. What is that? Well, first off, that is the actual multi-factor measure for the open air fields. Okay, 0.00112. What is that? Well, we can articulate that. That is also 0.00112 tons of strawberries per dollar spent on the open air fields. Okay, 0.00112 tons isn't very intuitive, but I did the arithmetic here, and if you're assuming that there's 2,000 pounds in a ton, what that is revealing, if you want more interpretation for 0.00112, that is indicating that they are getting about 2.4 pounds of strawberries per every dollar they spend on the open air fields. Oh, okay, so there you go. It asked how productive are their open air fields. That is a good statement. Okay, about 2.4 pounds of strawberries per dollar spent. Now, that's not the only question that's asked here in this scenario. Because there are two different operations, right? The open air fields versus the tunnel operation, which we kind of just blew past there working on the first question. Oh, right, but now the scenario follows up, and on this next note page it says, how much more productive is its tunnel operation? In order to comment on this, we need to do, now see how this is a very similar looking table in here? We need to do the same computations for the tunnel operation. Open air fields, we already did that. See page before, right? See page before in here, although, well, by the way, all that work to find this out, that is the actual multi-factor productivity measure there. Now, tunnel operation. Now, tunnel operation, I have to remember back from the original story. With the tunnel operation, they only had 10 acres under tunnels, high plastic tunnels. Those acres, I'm spying at my notes, those acres had supplied 20 tons of strawberries. Okay, this was all from when the scenario started out earlier. We're going to need that information just like we did last time for the open air fields because, oh, for instance, tons of strawberries. Oh, by the way, this is from the original where the story started. Oops, not acres, duh, 20 tons. The tunnels produced 20 tons of strawberries. I'll make a little note to myself, and you can go back and check this in the story, but there's 10 acres here that are under cultivation in the tunnels. Total expenses, though, in order to do our ratio, we'd have to fill out that same invoice again. Okay, let's see, it began with, I'm just going to write chemical here. Chemical. Oh, wait a minute. Originally, it set a different price for chemical treatment under the high tunnels, right? $225 per acre for preventive chemical treatments for the tunnel operation. That is the correct charge. I pull in here $225 per acre. Wait, there's only at least 10 acres under cultivation in the tunnels. So total chemical expense, if you will, $2,250. Okay, that's chemical. Now, we remember that with the tunnel operation, they quoted us a construction and maintenance cost. You know, it didn't apply to the open air fields. Well, now it does. So let's see, construction and maintenance, I'm just going to write construct there. What it is that they actually quoted, they said it costs $250 per acre to construct and maintain those tunnels. So there's the 250 times, again, it's only 10 acres that they have under tunnels, but that means that we spent $2,500 on the tunnels themselves. Then we have planting. It's the same old planting expense as the open air fields incurred. It's what, $125 per acre, and here there's only 10 acres under cultivation, so we only spent $1,250. And then finally, harvest and packing. Harvest and packing was, it's the same charge, $600, and we remember, oops, that's per ton. Per ton, and in this case it was 20 tons of strawberries. So we spent a total of $12,000 on that in the tunnel operation. Total expense. I add up the chemical expense, the construction expense, the planting expense, and the harvest and packing expense, and I get, check me on this, that we spent $18,000 last year supposedly on the high tunnel operation. Okay, now wait a minute, but that's not the answer all by itself, because the productivity measure that expresses the productivity of the high tunnel operation is the output, 20 tons of strawberries divided by that, the value of all the inputs. Oh, okay, so over here for tunnel operation, because remember this is what we got for open air fields. For tunnel operation, you take the 20, that's the output, and you divide it by the 18,000, right? That's what came up from here. and I get 0.00111. That has the same interpretation as previously with the open air fields. What is that? That is 0.00111 tons of strawberries per dollar spent on the high tunnel operations. Or once again, like somewhat around 2 pounds of strawberries per dollar that you are spending on the operation. Oh, and I put a box around it, right? Because we did all that work to get that number. We have to remember what the question was, because that isn't actually itself directly the answer to the question. Return to the question, is it more productive than its tunnel operation? Talking about, remember, the open air fields. Is this more productive than that? Well, what you want to do is look at, remember this is the number we got last time for the open air fields. This is the number that we get for the tunnel operation. To answer the question, you want to compare those two numbers, because the higher number wins. In this type of analysis, the higher number is indicating greater productivity, the lower number less productivity. The question is are the open air fields more productive than the tunnel operation? Just quoting exactly what's on the paper, open air fields has a slightly higher number. Answer, yes. The open air fields are, I'd say, slightly, I mean, let's look at the difference between these two numbers, slightly more productive, according to this measure. Maybe I should also note that. That is our answer to the question that was asked. Truthfully, it looks like these two different means or processes for growing strawberries do appear to have very, very similar productivity. So it sort of makes sense. Maybe that is why, sort of strategically, that Lanark isn't relying strictly on one or the other. But nonetheless, the actual direct answer to that second question, after all of that scratch work, is simply yes. Yes, it is at least slightly more productive.